My name is Rouben Azizian. I'm here to moderate this panel on defense and security. I'm also listed as a speaker, and since I'm listed as a speaker, I will speak first and then let the panelists say their opinions about defense and security. I know you must be a very tired group, although you don't look tired at all. Thank you for that. But you're also probably a very securitized group by now, because every panel I attended so far has had something to say about security. So since you are securitized, relax and let the panel walk you through some of the challenges and strategies in defense and security. And we have a distinguished panel that I will introduce after I finish my speech, which has 9 points. Point number one, I'm very pleased that we have actually put defense and security together as a topic of the panel, but the relationship between defense and security has historically been very problematic. There was time when we thought of security as being mostly defense. After the end of the Cold War, suddenly security became much broader, and defense was starting to get a little diluted in the security. And now we have the rise of geopolitics, and are we going to see again a security which is more of a defense? That's my first question. Secondly, this is not a secret anymore, I think, that New Zealand is going to finally release its first national security strategy. That's a fantastic accomplishment. But it will be interesting to see how the national security strategy of New Zealand will incorporate the several defense strategies and assessments, and what will this strategy present in terms of a hierarchy of security and defense, and how will the national security strategy provide guidance for our future defense strategies and assessments. And I think our defense people are used to running their strategies very much by themselves, and now they have to align with the national security strategy. So it will be a fun experience for some of us academics to watch. Third point I would like to make is that we have been talking about internal conflicts becoming the norm of today. 90% of international conflicts since the 90s have been internal intrastate conflicts. However, according to the Uppsala conflict data analysis, most of these internal conflicts had some external influence. So we are seeing this interdependence of intra and interstate, and of course, Ukraine war is another demonstration where some internal tensions have exploded into a full-fledged aggression and war. My other point is also, after the end of the Cold War, we thought non-traditional issues are going to dominate our security discourse. We are talking about, non-traditional kind of non-defense issues. And increasingly, the defense force was expected to do disaster management or COVID quarantine protection issues, which I don't think was a very encouraging sign for some of our traditional defense people. So the next question is, how is the role of defense force going to change with this rise of geopolitics in the Pacific? So the synopsis, I'm sure you read, talks about the many assumptions that are now being reassessed in terms of defense and security in the Pacific. The Pacific that was considered to be as a relatively quiet, benign area free of, sphere of influence, intentions, and geopolitical rivalry is drawing attention of major powers. So what does it mean? I'm pretty sure some of you wanted to attend the other session on multilateralism, but don't worry, we'll do both here. Because one of the topics today will be the impact of all these minilateral arrangements, the AUKUS, the Quad, the global reach of NATO that will be, I'm sure, part of our discussion and debate. I've been reminded by organizers of this conference that this is not just about talking about problems, but it's also finding solutions. So I've instructed our panelists, including the Member of Parliament, because he serves the people, that they please come up with one or two solutions to the existing problems. But can I also suggest that I think from experience, every solution would inevitably lead to some new problems. So when you're offering your solution, can you also identify a potential problem? Because that will help the organizers of the next conference to come up with some good topics for sessions and panels. We have a very inclusive panel today, and it's my privilege to introduce briefly. I'm sure you have read and reread their biographies, but we have, in the order of presentation, we have Tim van den Molen, Member of Parliament, Opposition Spokesperson for Defence and Veterans. Tim is a Member of Parliament for Waikato. He has also has had some army experience as an officer in the New Zealand Army Territorial. So he has not only political but also some military experience there. Our second speaker is someone I work for, so I'll be a bit nervous here. Professor Bethan Greener is the head of the School of People, Environment and Planning. The school has a long name, and the head of the school has a long list of expertise. Beth does international relations, she does defense, she has done and written on police and law enforcement, so I'm very pleased to have Beth. And our final speaker is someone who represents the business. So we have a very inclusive session because we have a politician, we have an academic, and we will have a business person. Randy is the regional director for India, Asia, and the Pacific for Boeing. But he, too, has spent many years in service to the U.S. Army, retiring as a colonel in the Army Aviation. And also, he's an academic, former professor of mathematics, correct? And so with that, I will invite our speakers. So we have asked Tim to elaborate on national parties' perspectives on defense and security challenges. And my other tentative suggestion for the topic was what's wrong with Labour's policy on defense and security. But that's an alternative topic you may choose not to cover. I know you had hearings today in Parliament. You were grilling the Minister of Defense. And so it will be great to hear what the outcome of that was. And then we'll have Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all. Thank you for that introduction, Rouben, and for the opportunity to be along here this afternoon. It has been a busy day. We've come straight from Parliament, so there's a bit of concern around whether I was going to show up for the session, I understand, but Air New Zealand was running on time, so that's great. So yes, we did have the estimates hearing today, which is effectively where the Minister comes in, and you can ask questions of the Minister and the Chief of Defence Force to get some insights into the budgetary commitments they've just made in the May budget that they outlined recently. And so that was a good opportunity to test their thinking around some of the investments they've made and some of the other areas that we might like to see a bit more investment in. So look, today I just wanted to touch on a few of those areas. I'm not going to be especially political about it because I think you'd probably prefer just a broad cross-section of perspectives around some of the challenges as we see them politically. And defence is actually a portfolio that is not especially political. Generally, we have a reasonably bipartisan approach to it. Of course, there's some difference within that, but we all want to ensure the safety and security of New Zealand, first and foremost. How we go about doing that sometimes is where we see the differences coming through. So look, you're all aware we're seeing an increasingly unstable and evolving geopolitical environment. And when you think about what that looks like now versus only 2 years or 5 years ago, it has rapidly changed. You look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, first and foremost, I think that has come as a shock to most people that you could have this sort of conflict in this day and age where we all thought that was consigned to the last century. Clearly it's not, it's here, and we have played a role in contributing to that. The government have done some great work in making contributions there, because it is really critical for us, despite being on the opposite side of the world, to stand up strongly for the international rules-based order, because that is pretty fundamental to how we operate. We're a really small country. We like to think we're big and punch above our weight in the world, and we do, but we do rely very strongly on that international rules-based order to ensure that we have some sort of level pegging with a lot of our larger export countries that we interact with as well. And because we are so trade-oriented, we rely even more so on those aspects as well. So the South China Sea is another area where we have seen increasing tension, particularly over the last couple of years. And that might seem like it's a long way away from here, and we might seem immune to these sorts of things like the Russian invasion, but actually it does matter for us. We export 95% of what we produce here in New Zealand from a food and fibre perspective, a lot of it out of the beautiful mighty Waikato just down the road. $20 billion worth of our exports go through the South China Sea. So it does matter what happens up there. So a conflict in that region, or even the increasing tensions we're seeing, has real implications for us. And so we do need to follow that quite closely. And of course, closer to home into the Pacific and South Pacific region, there's a lot of increasing uncertainty around the tension coming through from both the US and China operating in that space and looking to have a role to play, and then us trying to navigate through what that looks like for us, where we do have an opportunity to be a comparatively larger country, playing a leadership role within that Pacific context for a lot of those small island nations. And we have deep cultural connections into many of those countries. I think something like 5 of the current Pacific leaders did their studying here in New Zealand, and that goes back generations. So we have those deep connections that other countries do not. And so that gives us the opportunity to play quite a pivotal role in some of those discussions that need to happen. Now, we saw the government put out their Defence Assessment 2021, highlighting 2 key issues. One around responding to climate change, the impact of that as a defence priority, and secondly around the risk of a state actor operating in this region. So those are the 2 key aspects in 2021, and we've effectively seen that coming through. And you can look at the challenges we've had from a weather perspective, in particular over the last 6 months, that has caused significant uncertainty around how we respond and indeed the role that defence plays. And I think the expectation now is that our Defence Force plays a very strong role in terms of a HADAR function, the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, has a really critical role to be able to be an early responder and deliver immediate capability for a specific purpose. Now, we saw that role played by Defence during COVID as well, in terms of managing and supporting some of those boundaries and borders and isolation facilities that were set up. That sort of thing is okay, but the problem I had with that was actually it went on too long. And it saw our Defence Force involved in an area that is not core business for them, and we've seen some challenges off the back of that. So when you think about our ability to respond, as we see more uncertainty coming through, we need to be able to respond more rapidly and in more innovative ways and in a nimble fashion as well. Now, as a small country, that's something we should be able to do. The challenge we've seen over the last couple of years is that attrition in defence has been a massive issue, and so we've been running about 15.5% was the attrition rate across the Defence Force last year. And I raise that because it actually impacts our ability to deliver on some of those requirements of the government of the day. When you think about needing to get troops out on the ground for whatever it may be, so we had the Tongan eruption, when was that, early last year. We were the first ones up there to provide support, and that's exactly the sort of thing we should be doing, and that was really good to see. But now we're seeing, roll forward 12 months, the response to Cyclone Gabriel was good from Defence. They had over 1,000 people involved, but actually it wasn't great. At their own admission, they weren't able to deliver exactly the capabilities they would have wanted to because they were impacted by the lack of personnel to man those vessels primarily. So those are some of the real challenges we have to address. Recruitment has ramped up, and the government in their budget did allocate a significant increase in funding for wages, which will certainly help some of that. But of course, it's not as simple as just recruiting. If you're losing people with 10, 11 years experience in leadership roles and you're recruiting at the grassroots, private and equivalent ranks, it takes time to build that capability back up. So that is a real challenge for us. Alongside that is the investment in new capabilities. And this is always a challenge. Whenever New Zealand considers defence spend, you have to line that up against everything else, right? And you're probably all aware at the moment we've got this cost of living crisis. It's outrageous, through the roof, government's out of control. These are the lines we throw out anyway. And then alongside that, you've got challenges around health, around law and order, around education. And so when you line up those priorities, for most Kiwis, defence doesn't rank above those 4 priorities. And so it is a challenge to justify increased spend for any government. Labor's had that now, and we've had it previously as well. So we need to work through what that looks like, how do we do that, and how do we ramp up the prioritisation of that. And for me, it's around understanding that we can never compete at the level of Australia or the United States, for example, but we can do some niche capabilities incredibly well. We do that already, and we need to focus on where the opportunity is to increase our output in those particular areas. And so for me, that's why I'm really interested in what the information domain opportunity is for us. Right, you've got land, air, sea and information domains. And in terms of the cyber capability in particular, there is some amazing tech out there. New Zealand does some of this stuff really well. It doesn't have to be a massive investment cost, and it's jobs here in New Zealand. And that's the opportunity that I see in terms of proposing some of those solutions, is looking at areas where we can add direct value for a defence perspective, but also in terms of economic opportunity, creating jobs here and investing in tech here, and then being able to commercialise some of that technology outside of a military use as well. So you might have some tech, for example, in the agri sector that can cross over as well. There's some amazing agri-tech going on around measuring pasture growth rates and soil fertility from satellite imagery, some of these sorts of things that have massive opportunity, again, from a maritime perspective, if you're able to surveil more accurately our EEZ, the 4th largest EEZ in the world, right, rather than sending some frigates or patrol vessels out to do loops in the ocean. If we can be more precise around some of that, then actually it helps with some of the other targets we have around emissions reduction and dealing with climate issues as well. So there's significant opportunity to invest more in that information domain, which can then also provide direct benefit at a civil level in terms of our councils utilising that within their systems, and a commercial application as well. So that's probably the main lens I'm looking at in terms of where we can see investment opportunity. Alongside that, there's a good discussion to be had around where we fit within our traditional partners. Obviously, we're part of the Five Eyes arrangement with Australia, the US, UK and Canada, but more recently we've seen the evolution of AUKUS now coming through. And the first pillar being primarily around submarines is not a role for New Zealand. The nuclear capability is not going to be a part of our future. But Pillar 2 is a different story. There's significant opportunity to look at the technology opportunities, again, within that, the quantum computing, the AI, there's some really innovative stuff happening. And again, New Zealand is already leading in some of these areas. We have a significant challenge to continue to invest in that, but we can add direct value to our partners if we do so. And this is one of the things that we need to be looking quite closely at, because if we are seeing this increasing pressure within our region and it continues to escalate, we will be reliant on our partners for support, and we will need to be able to demonstrate support to them. So it is critical that we can step up actually and provide some direct capability. So the RIMPAC exercise that was held last year, I think it was, we sent our vessel, the Aotearoa, up there, and that was the main supply vessel in there. There was a fantastic demonstration of a niche capability we have. Now that's a bit bigger, but actually we can do some of that stuff well. The tech and the fit out that we have in front of us is huge. Alongside that though, that HADAR function that I touched on earlier is one of the areas where we really need to demonstrate that we're adding direct value for Kiwis every day if there's a disaster, but also into that Pacific region. And when you look at that from a security perspective, and I just want to finish on this bit, and I'm happy to take questions. I can talk all day about this stuff. I'm pretty passionate about it, but we'll get into more detail under questions. But I just want to finish on some of those security aspects, because when I think about security, I think about some of the resilience of infrastructure, the redundancy capacity that we do or don't have domestically. And you look at the likes of Marsden Point closing up north, the level of storage capacity we have for fuels here in New Zealand, and the fact that our supply routes, as I mentioned, go right up through the Pacific and into the South China Sea. If we have any issue, we are going to be cut off from a lot of those products, materials that we rely on. And so we need to think about that context as well. About energy security, are we ensuring that we have what we need to deliver here? And you look back at the cyclones as well, we saw a lot of power outages around the east coast, of course, impacted our ability to communicate, even between Hamilton and Tauranga down my way, the roads were all closed, between our fourth and fifth largest city. We just don't have that resilience of infrastructure. So that's some of the stuff we need to be looking at around the more strategic view of what does security look like in the New Zealand context. So look, I'll leave it there because I realise I've hit my 10-minute mark, but I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to some questions on any of those topics or anything else defence related. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I've had the great pleasure of sitting here all day and hurriedly rewriting all my notes as everybody's been speaking. And I'm even going to mimic Rouben because I had 9 points, but I had them before you had 9 points, so it's all good. But some of the things which have been raised today, I mean, academics are like magpies. There are things that have been raised which I have been furiously scribbling down because they connect to a lot of what I've been interested in for many years. So I was asked, thanks, Ruben's added one more to the list. I was asked to talk about security trends, responses, solutions, and now I need to do solutions to solutions. So we'll see how we go in 10 minutes. I think it's been quite clear today, and at least in the panels that I've been in, that there's been much mention of climate. And I thought I was pretty clever because the 2021 Defence Assessment has strategic competition first and climate last, at least in the blurb on the website. And I thought, oh, well, I'm going to put them the other way around. Andrew Little did that 6 days ago at the Shangri-La dialogue. So I'm again behind, like I'm behind Rouben on the 9 points, I'm behind Andrew Little on swapping those over. But that's because, to my mind, that climate's not only an existential threat to parts of New Zealand, potentially, to the Pacific, to our interests and values, but also there's an instrumental element there as well in terms of if we are worried about competition or contest, being the first to help is possibly going to be one of those areas of possible conflict. So it's a potential site for increased attempts to influence or leverage as well. So I think there's a multifaceted component there. There's also a whole range of things like gendered impacts or differential impacts for different groups, which I think need to be brought to the surface. In terms of strategic competition, I almost brought a PowerPoint just so I could put strategic competition up there and then put a cross through it, because I hate that terminology. I've managed to make myself quite unpopular with some other academics by asking, why do we think strategic competition exists? And being told that I'm naive, which goes down really well with women. But I think it's just, I don't like the terminology because I think it's oversimplistic and potentially deterministic. And it's been really interesting to see some of the terminology used today to move around some of that. So, for example, I'm thinking about the previous discussion from our Assistant Secretary of State out of the US, talking about investing, aligning, and competing. And I'm sitting there going, do we need the last one? Can't you just invest and align and attain your objectives that way? But the consensus seems to be amongst many that there is strategic competition. At least there's something in that vernacular. Again, haven't quite figured out the wording. Maybe it's not English that I need to go to. Maybe we need to go to something else. But we're concerned about the minilaterals. We're concerned about the Sino-Russia alignments. We're engaging in some of this process ourselves with regards to New Zealand's increased defence cooperation with Japan, for example, last week. But one of the things that really concerns me is we see often the physical manifestations of this most easily. We see As one of my PhD students talks about this, he's going to love me doing this shout out, floating pieces of metal in the ocean or in the sky as being the strongest manifestations of this idea of strategic competition. But I think it's the grey zone that is really what we need to be thinking about in terms of disinformation and influence, as well as things like financial and other forms of pressure. So I kind of snuck in there 3 trends: climate, strategic competition, and one which isn't really a trend, but I can get away with this, so I'm going to, which is complexity. Basically, the combination of things, and I quite liked our 2016 defence policy statement talked about complex disruptors, which was kind of slightly odd, but I quite liked where they were going with that. In terms of stretching our capabilities, and we know in military context concurrency is a problem, for example, trying to battle 2 things at once. So stretching our capabilities, which are tiny already, our effort and our focus and our dollar. So events in cyber and space, or biological or geoeconomic spaces, I think, are going to be really important. And one of the things that Max Boot mentioned was that it's easier to defend and harder to attack in conventional senses. I think it's the other way around with the non-conventional. It's easy to attack and hard to defend. So I think that's going to be really, really problematic for us. We can talk about, should we be in Pillar 2 of AUKUS, those sorts of things in the questions. So I'm thinking in terms of responses so far, what I've seen, thinking about things like climate and this idea of strategic competition, I've enjoyed New Zealand trying to amplify. So for example, at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year, bringing to the fore and kind of doing shout-outs to Pacific neighbours about climate change. I thought that was really important. And I liked Golriza's mention of the need to be mana enhancing in the way in which we are working in this space. We're still engaged in institutions. We love institutions. We like to be in, not out. We like regional structures. We love ASEAN centrism when it works for us. The UN's gone a little bit quiet. But we have to remember things like trade as an institution, diplomacy as an institution. And I've been watching too much popular television, and there was this great, ranting speech by Rufus Sewell about diplomacy fails until it doesn't. And I think the mention by the Foreign Minister this morning of the High Seas Biodiversity Agreement saying, hey, there still is room for this, even in this contested situation that we're in. I think the third thing that we've done in terms of response is I think we're trying to be nuanced and trying to understand rather than just react. And that can be a really difficult thing to do in international affairs. We love our tropes, particularly in the West. We love our good and our evil, and our bad and our good. So it's trying to understand things and relay that to the public. That's going to be really important. And I missed that panel, unfortunately. But I thought it was really interesting. One of the presenters this morning spoke about the narrative of the Indo-Pacific and reclaiming that as a site of prosperity, not just as a site of security or competition. So I think the way in which we understand things, part of that too is understanding domestic influences. There was mention of what happens in 2024 if we have Trump. Part of that's thinking about the South China Sea has been mentioned. I've been listening to people far more au fait with China than I, talking about that a lot of that contestation from Beijing came out of very particular interests in particular party officials trying to increase their fiefdoms, rather than it being about something else. So understanding our environment, I think we've started. I think we need to do more. Solutions, I think New Zealand can do more in terms of enabling space for cooperation. Information sharing, relationship building. We've talked a lot over the day about relationships, and I really enjoyed, having worked in international relations, the fact that our Fijian Prime Minister talked about international relationships, I think is really important, because at the end of the day, we don't have cardboard cutouts of, China and the US shaking hands. We have people doing that, and I think it's very easy to abstract in international affairs. So preventive diplomacy, I think, is really important. Long-term views has been mentioned today, and that's the national security strategy for the United States, Biden's national security strategy, does talk about needing to think about not just China now, but China in the longer term. China will be here. So how does the US manage for a long term? And we're not very good at that in the West anyway. Okay, so thinking about that, thinking about being in the West, I've really enjoyed, just briefly saw on Twitter, lucky I'm going to do a shout out to Nick Ross Nick Ross Smith and Bonnie Holster, who've brought out a piece about what it means to bring Māori values into a foreign policy. And I think there's definitely something that we need to be thinking about with regards to how we shape our understanding of the world and how we engage in it, because a lot of our terminology comes from our particular Pākehā approach to things, where we talk about democracy, human rights, rule of law. We're comfortable with those things. But when we swap those out for things like manaakitanga or whanaungatanga, then we begin to have slightly different take on things. And I think that's been quite important, and potentially something, thinking of solutions, that gives us more things to navigate through. So I think this is kind of where I'm going to the end. We've got a comparative advantage as New Zealand by being New Zealand, by not being somebody else. So although there's a great deal of pressure in terms of things like alignment, what I think we don't do very well, and I would like to see our esteemed colleagues do this a little more, is to sell our independence, because we say it a lot and people get annoyed at us for that. You and your independent foreign policy, thanks, that's really not helpful sometimes. But a unique New Zealand approach, particularly in places like the Pacific, is of great value to our partners, because we are not being our partners. They can be themselves and we are somebody different. So I think we need to sell it a little more. I had a very irate Australian squadron leader grumble at me the other day to say, we're always so critical of Australia and the Pacific, and aren't we lucky to kind of be on their benign, have them as the benign neighbour. Yes, we are, but so is Australia lucky that we're a benign neighbour as well. And I think sometimes that's quite a difficult thing. Not that we're particularly large and powerful, but that's an important thing to recognise too. So lastly, diversity. Recognise the comparative advantage we have abroad. Recognise that we need comparative advantage within agencies within New Zealand. I've long been concerned about what the NZDF gets dumped with, because it's the expeditionary capable force. What can other agencies do? Is there other structures we should be using? Leverage our best talent and bring our best views. That means things like gender equality. That means things like ensuring that we have diversity at the table, which we don't have in our agencies nearly enough. I know agencies are working hard, you need to work harder, particularly in the security space. And finally, I just wanted to give a shout out to the Foreign Minister's emphasis on the Treaty of Waitangi as guidance. I think that has been that's such an amazing thing for New Zealand to be able to base its foreign policy on. The fact that Māori and Pākehā are trying to figure out how to work together and alongside and respect and move forward, that's what international affairs is. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon. You've made it. The last panelist on the last panel of the last day. You've made it through the whole day. Your head's filled with all kinds of ideas. And now I get to close it out before we go to the real value, which is the Q&A. And then added pressure on the other side of this panel are drinks over on the other side. And Hamish, are they free drinks? Yeah. Oh, well, that makes it even more difficult. So thanks for this opportunity. Really thank you to NZIIA for the chance. Thanks for inviting someone who's not an academic, who's not a government, who's not even from the region, to present a different perspective. And perhaps, Rouben, I'm probably going to disappoint you in that I won't necessarily have a solution, but I'll have a framework for a solution. Hopefully that'll get me at least a C+ in my grade. So you heard a little bit. I am in a somewhat fortunate position here that I have viewed national security and the challenges that come along with that from many different perspectives. You saw my bio. I was once an operational commander in the field, so I saw the end result of those purchases and acquisitions that provided the tools to implement that instrument of foreign policy. I served in the United States Senate and saw how the political debates that go along with that. I was in a think tank at one point, and now I'm on the business side. And I feel like it is one of those where to really get to that good solution, you have to have all of those perspectives and consider all those perspectives and touch on those to help yourself come up with those solutions. I realize my badge says Boeing, but I think I'm the only industry person that has really had a chance to speak today, so I realize I'm representing writ large the defense industry. And the theme of this really resonates with me when it started with, finding solutions and then the New Zealand's place in a troubled world. And part of that is, I've seen that world, the troubled world. My responsibility now is the Asia-Pacific region writ large. And different places I go, whether it's Korea or Japan or India or Singapore or Indonesia, Australia, what I find is it's a tough neighborhood. There's a lot going on in this neighborhood and a lot of actors to contend with, both financially, security-wise, but the finding solutions also resonates with me. Because while I might be a business person, I'm also a citizen of the United States, a citizen of the world, and live on that precious, fragile planet that provides us a place to live. I'm also the father of 2 soldiers. My son and daughter-in-law are both in, so that I have a vested interest in not coming to anything along those lines and providing for that deterrence. So how do you get there? The MP said it very clearly. It comes down to difficult choices. You're investing the nation's treasure, and you have to figure out what the best investments of those are. And there's no easy equation to rack and stack those. And not just the nation's treasure, but it's each individual taxpayer's hard-earned money and their time and their future. So how do you balance those? And you can't do, like the Prime Minister said, you can't sit on your hands. It's not that time. There is something that has to be done. What that is, I leave that to those who are running the government and running the world, but the important thing is to help provide that counsel. So if I asked anybody in here, what's industry's role in national defense, a lot of people out there would probably say, make money. And while there is an element to that, it's not really for the reasons you might think or might jump to mind. I know we in our company really view it, and being half of our company being a defense company, industry's role is to help find affordable solutions to national challenges. There's a challenge, and to help find a solution to that. And that solution may not be build a big new aircraft that somebody buys. It might be use what you have differently. It might be, hey, there's a partner we work with is doing the same thing, maybe you should talk to them. But it is to try to assist with those challenges, assist with those solutions. So how do you do that? How do you come up with those solutions? And a big part of it is that open, candid conversation and dialogue and bringing in all those different perspectives I originally said. How many times there are, I know I've seen it in my country, that a decision maker, especially if it's a politician, signs us up for something there's no way you can make that schedule, there's no way you can make that cost, and by the way, at the end, it's not going to do what you thought it was going to do. The policy was ahead of the technology. On the other hand, there's times where technology was further ahead than people thought it was, and didn't realize there was a better solution out there. The beauty of that is the solution for that's the same regardless, and that's really those open communications, asking the questions, bringing those folks in to assist in, is this possible, is it affordable, is it deliverable, and continuing those conversations. An anecdote, when I worked in the Pentagon, there were senior general officers I rode in a car with one time that viewed his career as a huge success because he had never testified in front of Congress, never spoken to a reporter, and never talked to industry. And that was, to me, like the trifecta of failure. Because you have to get your story out. You have to engage those folks who make the decisions. You have to talk with the people you're buying things from or expecting to deliver to you. So open those lines of communications, bring those people in. I used to sit in those decisions in the Pentagon, and every now and then when I drive past there, I wish I was in there. I realize I'm insane at that moment when I think that, but that's not my role anymore. That's not industry's role to be in the decision maker. It's to inform them to then go and have those tough, difficult choices on where do they invest that treasure. So interestingly, one of the things I've noticed in this region, and the MP hit on it perfectly, I don't know if this is going to make you feel better or worse, that the same challenges, maritime awareness and security, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, the same ones I see throughout the region. Fleet modernization is another one. That one's a little bit different in New Zealand. The good news is there are others out there to collaborate with. Another role that industry can have, when I used to work on a program, a defense program, we had contracts with 5 different countries, and we, as the people building the aircraft and designing them, were the only ones that knew what everybody else was doing. And there were sometimes one of the countries, we want to do this, and we'd think, have you talked to them? Because they've already done that. They've already paid for it, they already know how to do it, they've already found out the problems with it, the goodness of it. We couldn't tell them what they were doing, but we could at least marry them up to have those conversations with like-minded folks. So I realize my time is running out. I can't wait to get to the questions and answers. But again, I would implore those to embrace people outside of your comfort zone, to open those lines of communication, to have those conversations, which will make for far better informed decisions as you're trying to figure out how do we utilize this implement of foreign policy that is called defense to achieve our solutions and do it in an affordable, easy, or affordable, achievable manner. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rouben.
Thank you. Very encouraging but also disciplined panel, isn't it? Watching the time and everything. So we have enough time for questions, so please show your energy and motivation. Can't hear you. Speak up.
I'm interested to know from the panel if it's in New Zealand's interest to expand Five Eyes, i.e. allow Japan to come to.
Could you hear the question? It's about expanding the Five Eyes to bring Japan in, right?
Yeah. Look, my comment was this. I thought the most key thing out of that was Tim's, what he said about New Zealand potentially signing up to the AUKUS Pillar 2. So that's a significant, and I agree with it, cool. But I was interested with the panel, their views on, is it in New Zealand's interest to expand the Five Eyes, i.e. allow Japan to join?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Look, I think ultimately what we're trying to work on here is stability within the region, right? That's what we want to achieve, that's the outcome. And to Beth's point, it's not about strategic competition, it's about all being able to succeed. And each country will measure success differently. And so in terms of that, that's why I talked to the AUKUS opportunity as well, because there is benefit there for New Zealand to consider that. And when we are a trade-oriented nation, when we rely on that international rules-based order, we do need to set some clear lines around where we do or do not believe things are appropriate. So other countries that align with that, absolutely, there's an opportunity to expand that conversation. Japan, for example, sure. I mean, we've got the Quad as well. So we're starting to see a number of these things pop up, right? So it wasn't that long ago we didn't have these sorts of formal groupings. And now it's become so much more topical that we have Five Eyes and now AUKUS and the Quad and all these groupings that are trying to deliver better outcomes within a specific geographic area. But yeah, there's certainly a discussion to be had around, well, do we just look at a broader opportunity? And I suspect you're alluding a bit to a Southern Hemisphere equivalent of NATO, which brings together a group of like-minded countries to try and deliver stability. So certainly conversations, and we've seen Japan increase significantly their defence spending. Just in the last few months it's been announced, if you've seen that. So some really interesting work in that space, but yeah, look, like-minded countries should continue that dialogue.
Is that working? Still no. Just about the AUKUS Pillar 2, I know there's quite a lot of contestation around this at the moment, and it kind of at first glance it may look like there's an awful lot to be gained from the access to the kind of technology and the developments around AI and quantum computing and so on. But I think there is a bigger picture question, and whether or not other avenues can achieve the same ends anyway. We just had the Assistant Secretary of State talk about a bilateral tech dialogue. There's mention of Rocket Lab and other avenues. But I actually also really wanted to do a shout out for my colleague Anna Poles, who was supposed to be here at the Indo-Pacific panel, but unfortunately is unwell with COVID, of all things. And Anna, in responding to the question about Pillar 2, talked about how New Zealand has fought to be seen as part of the Asia-Pacific, not an Anglo-Antipodean outpost. And it's a bit, some of the discussion that we've been having about the adoption of the Indo-Pacific kind of discussion and things, and that being in tension with the Blue Pacific kind of concept. I think New Zealand's still in a position where we need to bear some of those things in mind. I don't think we're yet in a position to jump in. On Japan being in on the Five Eyes, that would be a big call, I think. Again, things have moved really quickly in the last few years in terms of looking at Japan's move. The whole Article 9 question and the kind of popular swing behind Abe's policies and things. But, from where I've worked and who I've talked to, there's still quite a lot of historically generated concern about Japan in a broader field. So I think it would have to be, that would have to be done very diplomatically, and again only after a lot of consideration of what the broader consequences are. So something which looks like a short-term win has got much bigger consequences.
Thank you. Randy, you have any perspective on Japan joining? No, okay. I don't see questions. Maybe can I ask the audience, do you think we should, or the Five Eyes should include new members? Raise your hand. See, that's the answer. Okay, more questions? Please, David.
Thank you, Rouben, and thank you to the panelists. This question is for Professor Greener. You mentioned at the end of your presentation about reconstructing the Western model of engagement and using the Treaty of Waitangi. As an academic, because government policy is the hardest thing to change, especially when it's so embedded and so forth. But how do you, as an academic, how do you see that change happening? And how, and also to MP Tim, how do you see that model of engagement, which sort of is basically like co-governance a little bit, and when we go down that line as such, how do you see that evolving into policy and being able to be embedded into policy to make that change? because it's something that's not going to happen overnight. You know, we've had 183 years since the signing of the treaty, you know, so let's hope it doesn't take another 183 years to happen.
Thank you for that question, David. That's a big question. As an institution at the university, everybody's way better people are grappling with this than me in terms of what is it to be Tiriti-led, you know, how do we actually manifest that? And that was one of the conversations in the panel that you were chairing, was sometimes the rhetoric is there and there's no actual stuff that happens underneath. And so this is partly why I was emphasising the need for diversity in the room, and it's why it's so good to see young people. I'm not putting the pressure on you, but I'm putting some pressure on you. No, because one of the things I notice is that sometimes we talk about, you know, I've seen meetings open with karakia and close with karakia, and yet there's no Māori in the room because the space isn't a friendly space, and it's broader than making the changes of name or the terminology or things like that. I think it's actually genuinely asking what priorities are, because my understanding is that, you know, there are a lot of iwi who fantastic Māori economies out there. And there was discussion in your panel too about, you know, iwi just go and do stuff in the Pacific. You know, you don't need to go through the state all the time. So I think recognising that exists and there is, you know, that kind of autonomy that happens, but also making room and potentially changing the way that we do things. So I've really noticed different styles of diplomacy. You know, the West, we're very direct and we point and we jab and we like to do things. And you know, you go into ASEAN or Pacific situations and you're not doing that. So I think it's being humble and unlearning that we don't have everything right. In fact, we've made quite a few mistakes and we could do with learning some stuff. And yeah, I think not the principle, because the principles and kind of that's all under contention now, but the terminology that's being used by the Foreign Minister at the moment, I think, is just there's an opportunity there to ease into spaces by there could be a change now, kind of, to use academic words, ontological and epistemological kind of way of being, by if we move into slightly different frames of understanding how the world is. And it was really interesting to hear the mention about lattice work, because I've often heard that frame of reference with regards to China's foreign policy. So, kind of rethinking things might change how we are. But, yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, look, I'll just make a couple of quick comments on that too. For me, it's about utilising our strengths. You know, and I touched on it in my comments at the lectern as well, that, you know, we have a culture-to-culture connection that other countries don't have, and that's something unique, something we should be proud of, and an opportunity for us to demonstrate leadership, but that leads to trade and other opportunities as well. We need to embrace that and explore that further. So there's definitely opportunities in that regard, and that's where, you know, we have our independent foreign policy. We can be unique, but at the same time, you've just got to keep talking to people. You know, keep that conversation going. And as Beth said before, it's not just about international relations, it's relationships, and having that ability to talk to someone, to be able to pick up the phone, to catch up, to have a yarn, tell some Kiwi story and make things happen. You know, we have an amazing way of being able to go out and interact in the world, and we need to make sure that we are continuing to utilise that, because that is a strategic advantage that we have that other countries don't necessarily have. I think, you know, as much as I love our friends in the US, it's a different context for people from the United States come to this region with their culture and background as it is for us.
Thank you. Randy, I have a question for you, otherwise you're starting to get bored there. Since you boldly introduce yourself as someone who represents the defense industry, what's your assessment of the role of defense industry in supporting Ukraine? Because we have heard praise for the industry being able to produce and supply, and we have also heard criticism when things were not available, the industry wasn't prepared, or the policy guidance wasn't good enough. So would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, you're going to make me regret making that comment, right? The whole the whole opportunity to grab the right lessons learned from everything that's going on in Ukraine is critically important. You heard it today, people were talking about, does it apply to China, Taiwan? Is it the same as Russia and Ukraine? Clearly not the same. There might be elements that are similar. Same thing with Ukraine. What do we learn in retrospect that we can apply? From a defense industry perspective, one of the things we learned was we lacked the production capacity, especially with lead time, to really properly supply them, especially in the area of munitions. You can go through your entire annual supply in 7 days. And when it's a lead time of 2 years to build more, what do you do for the next 1 year and 358 days? So it goes back again to those tough choices on how important is it to have hot production lines? How important is it to invest in that future, create stockpiles of those expendables that you think you'll go through? How important, and you'll see in the U.S. they're changing that policy now. They're looking to do multi-year contracts on missiles and artillery rounds and the like, and just stockpiling them because of those reasons. And then it's the simple things, it's everybody trying to do good and trying to do the right thing based off of their role in the world, but one of the challenges we have is contracting. And how long does it take to get actually on a contract? Because the contracting officers from both sides are judged based off of their boss, and it's, what did I get on my side in the negotiation? What did you get on your side? And we have to bring that up a level to, hey, this is way more about what's the importance on foreign policy or defense or operations than it is about 1 or 2% on either side that one side got and one side didn't. So again, a lesson learned will be the flexibility of those vehicles and mechanisms, the forward-thinking elements of it, and it all starts with the assessment of what really could happen in the next 2 or 3 years. How wrong did we get that? Up until the day before, there were people absolutely this will never happen. That's probably, in my opinion, the biggest lesson learned from there that also applies to Asia Pacific. It's not exactly what those elements will be, but how could we be so convinced it was going to go one way and it didn't? And then you look at it from Vladimir Putin's side. He was very convinced it was going to go a certain way and it didn't. So it's that forward thinking and how do you utilize that? But that's a great question, Rouben, and it really does go back to what things we could do better. And it's on the defense side as well on, again, advising the decision makers on the implications of those decisions. More than just dollars and cents, but this is those implications on how if you see the future this way, your decisions there are not supporting that vision.
Thank you. Sure. And
thanks. Yeah, I just want to touch on that briefly because it comes a bit to the final point I made around having some redundancy capacity or building resilience into your infrastructure. And defence industry has a role to play in that, but so does government, right? Like any business, and building and construction is one of my other portfolios. It's going into a bit of a downturn at the moment. There's a lack of housing out there, as you'll all be aware. Government needs to be able to send the right signals as well, right? So that industry then has confidence to invest. Industry has a role to play around developing new technologies, being prepared to invest in their own future, but they also need to see some signals being sent from government. And I think that's one of the things that has changed post Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that has shifted the dial significantly, and defence industry has ratcheted up in response to that. But yeah, it does take time, and you have to be able to have that conversation around what might happen, and therefore what do we need to invest to ensure that we are prepared.
thank you. How much do we have? A few more minutes, right? 5:10, kind of. I'm negotiating here. But 10, because I see lots of hands now, So maybe we take all 3 questions. Please, go ahead. 1, 2, and then 3, 4. We need 20 minutes. Go ahead.
You can always do
Yeah. Okay, yeah, sure. Can you...
Do you want to 10 past 5?
We have 10 minutes until Beth leaves, so if you can be please brief and you respond briefly, I think we'll be celebrated. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Kia ora. Indeed my favorite panel here, so thank you very much. The question I wanted to ask US Secretary Representative, but I missed the chance, so I would like to ask New Zealand representative from government what practical steps or practical solutions you envision for the biggest failure of world security, which is Security Council. So what is the solution for this? Well, theoretically we can say abolish veto power, but how practically you think it can be achieved, whether it will be reformed or whether like another organization will emerge?
Thank you. Next question, please, behind.
I'm just picking up on the New Zealand's unique place, because I think that the US has recognised the potential of Hawaii and some of its territories to play a similar role in trying to build the relationship out, particularly in the Pacific. And also want to acknowledge that I've been working with the US Secretary of the Navy on climate change work. They're funding stuff on climate change in Palau, and obviously there's geopolitical reasons for that. But we're seeing a real trend in the work we do. I work on climate change and sustainable development for the military to be a lot more involved in a positive and proactive way. And I think I just wanted to make a comment and see if people had anything to say about that.
Thank you. Who is next? Here. And then we'll move to there. One here, and that will be the last one, I think. Correct? Please.
Kia ora. My question is surrounding where the Global South kind of sits in this conversation, and particularly just referencing what you were talking about before, Tim, about how the defence portfolio isn't typically a very political one. But I think everyone can agree that defence and security is a massive issue in power relations, and often the defence and security issues that are happening in the Global South aren't really brought to the table. Particularly want to reference the forced disappearances that are happening in Mexico. It's one of the biggest human rights violations that we're seeing in our time, and I just want to, I guess, put it out to the floor how we're going to include the Global South in these conversations.
Thank you. The last one.
Mine's centred around AI and that sort of quickly developing technology. How do you think New Zealand can adapt to meet these new challenges from a security and defence standpoint?
Thank you very much. Great. Beth, you want to go first because you're leaving?
I'll just go quickly on the easy questions and then I'm going to run away. I'll start with yours with AI. My daughter's going to hate me for this, but she's just finishing a degree in cybersecurity and AI, and the frustration is that the universities, we're not really equipped to be doing this because it's moving so fast. So I think an investment in education and also education partnering with industry and with startups, I think, would be really important because it's moving incredibly quickly. Also working in an education sector where we don't say the word ChatGPT. So yeah, I think that's extraordinary. But I think one of the things which is also currently underplayed is the social ramifications. So there is work on the, say, the labour side, but yeah, the security and social ramifications. I think very quickly about the UN. That question's been asked, I think, since the UN basically, kind of immediately got stymied after at the start of the Cold War. I really liked the idea that was floated of giving the P5 partial vetoes. I don't know if that's ever going to come back again, but just give somebody half a veto and another person a third of a veto. The Security Council, it needs reformed, but the will to do it, yeah, that's been missing since forever. I thought there was a moment there in around 2005 after the war against Iraq, but didn't really get going.
Global South?
Global South. I actually did do some work on gender-based violence in Mexico, and it was really mind-blowing, the degree of violence. One of the things too is I'm going to get some. We haven't really talked about Latin America, so I think that's something else that's going to be increasingly brought into the conversation about if we're Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, then we need to be thinking about some of our relationships on that side as well. Yeah, that's a really tough question. I think it goes back to the issue of capability or capacity building rather than, but also there is a lot of critique over how we've done development or capacity building or, building partner capacity in the past. And I think that whole idea of actually going in with a needs-based kind of, what do you need? How do we help? Can we help? Because sometimes we think we can help when we just, elephants trampling around on things. So, yeah, being aware of limitations too, I think is really important. And just to shout out with regards to, yes, it's really interesting seeing the military is engaging with the issues around climate change. When we look at electrification of vehicles, military equipment's not going to be very easily electrified, so that is a major problem. But there are certain aspects which can be done, in that space. And sorry, I can't remember the first point that was made on that as well. No.
Hawaii.
Yeah, that's really interesting too. But I think that comparative advantage is a really important one that we haven't quite grappled with, understood ourselves, nor helped our partners to understand. So being a mini Australia is not really, even though we've taken Australian Army doctrine recently, is not really kind of useful. There's interoperability to a degree, perhaps, but there's that independence and differentness, which is actually really valuable, and I don't think it's recognised enough. Thank you.
Thank you. You have to leave now. Let's give a round of applause to Beth. Andrew, where is Andrew? Can you run? Beth, we need to give you something very expensive. Thank you. That was a small disruptor, but right. Okay. Randy, you want to talk about artificial? Oh, Tim, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in on a couple of those. The AI opportunity is massive, and that's part of the interest that I have in the AUKUS discussion as well, because there's an opportunity for us to play a leading role in that. We do some amazing work in AI and quantums and cyber, and there is an opportunity to be leading that. That is where we can add direct value for our partners if we continue to evolve that, which then adds direct value for the New Zealand economy, because those technologies can be across multiple industries, adding significant value into those as well. And then, of course, the climate aspect as well, right? If we've got great and improved tech, to my earlier comments as well, around some of the satellite capability, rather than burning diesel out on the ocean or any number of other, up in the air, if we're utilising better satellite tech, then there's opportunities there as well. And that then speaks to protecting fisheries and a whole range of other priorities for the Pacific too. I'm happy to go and explore the opportunity in Hawaii. This sounds great. But no, look, to that, I don't think it's as simple as someone saying, hey, we've got a territory out there, let's just use that. It speaks more to what I was saying earlier around having those historic connections. That takes a long time to build. You've got to earn that trust over generations, and so it's not going to be a simple move if the US try to exploit the Hawaii connection, for example. If they commit to it deeply over time, then there will be opportunity, but it's not a quick fix. In terms of the global south, yes, huge opportunity from a food and fibre perspective, actually, when you look at South America, when you look at Africa, in terms of productive capacity, it is absolutely huge. There is some real potential there, and again, this is where I get excited with my other hat on, being from the Waikato and the agri-tech space. There's some amazing innovation going on, and again, this is where I see, bringing those same opportunities together to develop and export more New Zealand tech. We are leaders in agriculture. We should be doing more to assist some of these other countries in that regard to help bring them up as well. And in terms of the Security Council, yeah, look, it's an interesting one for us to sit down here and say, hey, we can do our own thing. We stand by our independent foreign policy. It gives us the ability to be a bit more nimble than some other countries perhaps, but ultimately it's about trying to deliver outcomes, and when you look at what's been achieved through that, there are some challenges. I'd say it's not as efficient as most people would like it to be, and so the opportunity to improve that sits on the table. Whether or not there's sufficient desire to make that happen, yeah, I'm not sure there will be, unfortunately. But for us, getting back closer to home, it's on that leadership opportunity. You know, we can be out there playing a key role in this region, and we need to step up a bit more, I think.
Very briefly, please, because
yeah,
we
I'll
need
just
to
do two. The AI question. So people usually think about that when they read that in the paper about big countries with deep pockets developing AI and the value to them. The reality is the biggest value is to smaller countries, smaller defense forces, or those whose demographic, like in Japan, where it's an aging demographic, the pool that they can draw from gets smaller and smaller as they're trying to develop larger and larger capabilities or cover more space or the like. And AI is a great, AI and autonomy are great tools to be able to achieve that. And especially when a lot of the investment has already been done, there will be a chance to capitalize on that. And it should be in your kit bag as you're developing those solutions for the future. Like the MP talked about, you know, patrolling areas. Instead of having a big ship out there patrolling areas, you can have something else doing it. As far as the climate implications on military vehicles or military operations, again, from a business side, these are things, you know, as we place our bets, as we're looking to make investments in those areas, you know, we're looking 10 years out, sometimes 20 years out to try to figure out where we were. 10 years ago, you know, the idea of climate friendly or fuel, you know, not needing fossil fuels for not just the fuel, but also petroleum, oil, and lubricants was a really valuable possibility. So there were a lot of investments made that are now starting to come to fruition. And so you will see the military actually, not just because, hey, it's environmental friendly, but because it actually makes them more effective. Like someone previously said, you're in an operation, fuel is going to become a precious commodity. And if you are freed from that anchor, then that gives you more capabilities. So I think you're going to see more of that, and I know we're playing in that as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I was trying to be consistent, and I had a 9-point summary. But I will be utterly unpopular if I go ahead with that. So, but I teach at Massey University, and if you want to find out what the 9 are, you can contact me and come and do one of our courses. Marketing is allowed. Just to say a few words. I think that was a great range of topics and discussions. Importance of dialogue, importance of ensuring that public understands why we invest and why do we invest in capabilities. The importance of, you know, not only seeking support from others, but also offering what we have, and we have niche capabilities. Being able to not only proudly announce our independent foreign policy, but also share and promote experiences, including Treaty of Waitangi. And I have to say very briefly, with my Armenian background, the first thing the new Armenian ambassador who was appointed recently, he asked me, who do I talk to about New Zealand experience with dealing, you know, with minorities? And if you follow Nagorno-Karabakh problem, you know we are right there. How do we find solutions to these things? And how to actually harmonize technology and policy. I think these are all important. But I also have one official formal submission to the President of the Institute of International Affairs after hearing Prime Minister Rambuka and others. Maybe it's time to rename the Institute and start calling it New Zealand Institute of International Affairs and Relationships. With that, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. And, oh, thank you, thank you.
Thanks very much.
I didn't expect that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks well done. Yeah.
Thank you.